AJ, there'll be some folk that doesn't ken what William Soutar was, and I was wondering if you could tell us a wee bit about his background and his significance and his writings.
Well, he was born in 1898 in a flat on South Inch Terrace, just across the Inch from here, not very far away. His father was a joiner, later to become a master joiner, and a very well-known businessman in Perth. Mm-hmm. And his mother was a housewife, and mother was what intended to be at that time. And he grew up, he was a terrible, mischievous schoolboy. He was strapped every day at his primary school. This is him here. He once led a strike. At the time of the miners' strike in 1911, he led a strike and led all his fellow pupils across the Inch in solidarity with the striking proletariat. And then the bell went, and they all ran back
again.
He was strapped for that as well. So he went to Perth Academy, which was then just facing the North Inch. Mm-hmm. And when he'd finished his studies, he joined the Navy because it was 1916, the First World War was on, so he witnessed the surrender of the German fleet, but didn't really see any active service. However, he was invalided out because he had these pains in his feet and in his legs, and that was the first sign of the illness, which was in fact a hereditary illness, though he didn't know that, which was later to curtail his life so cruelly. Mm-hmm. So he's demobbed from the Navy. He goes to Edinburgh University. He has probably the best time of his life. He's away from home. He's doing all those things young men do at university, staying up all night, drinking too much, talking, playing the fool with his friends, going out with girls, all that. And he's also writing poetry and getting poetry published in university publications.
Is this the first time that he'd written any poetry, or had he done this at the school?
And he'd done it at school as well,
right.
Yes, and it'd been published in the school magazine. I have to say, the stuff he wrote at school is atrocious. School poetry tends to be, but everybody has to start somewhere.
Aye.
So he's at Edinburgh University, and in due course he graduates. Here he is, looking very handsome in his academic gown. And the plan is, because he doesn't get a very good degree, he gets a third-class degree, but he's enjoyed himself. So the plan is, he wanted to be a journalist, but the Scotsman wouldn't take him. So he thought, right, I'll train to be a teacher. But he started his course in Edinburgh and realised that the problem with his legs was so bad now that he really couldn't do it. So he came home to Perth to live with his parents. And by this time his father had built up his business and really become very successful and affluent. And this house, which is one of a pair, had been built. Mm-hmm. And his partner Tom McQueen, Mr. Soutar, the eldest partner Tom McQueen, lived next door, and the Soutars lived in this house. So at first Willie could sort of, potter around downstairs and in the garden, and would go out on outings to the Great Glen, that sort of thing, in the car. But gradually his health got worse and his mobility got worse, and in time he took to his bed. Mm-hmm. And then, in a way, begins the most fertile part of his life as a poet, but the most constricted part of his life as a man, because he was put into bed. If you can just see this picture here, that's the only known photograph of him in his bed. And instead of being out in the world came to him. He had an astonishing number of visitors. Hundreds and hundreds. I've got the figures written down somewhere. I haven't got them to hand, but really, 700 one year, 600 and something the next year. And these were both neighbours and friends, but also larger literary figures. It was a place of pilgrimage for anyone who was interested in writing before the Second World War, really. So Hugh McDermott was a friend, and I think, yes, here we are, Neil Gunn was a friend, Bill Montgomery, who later became known for collecting nursery rhymes, Scottish nursery rhymes.
So Souter was well quoted.
Oh yes, absolutely.
In his own day.
Oh yes, no, he brought out a number of collections. In those days, you had to pay to get your own. It was vanity publishing in a sense, in that his father paid for all his collections of poetry, but they were very well reviewed in the papers, and he had enormous influence. The most successful of his collections was the Bairn Rhymes, and these he wrote for his adopted sister Evelyn, who's there, and she was the Australian branch of the family actually, and she was orphaned in very, very early life. I think by the time she was about 4 she'd lost both parents, and so the Souters, who were good Christian folk, brought her across, and she became part of the family, and she had a very special relationship with Willie. I mean, in a way she was young enough to be his daughter, but she was his adopted sister, and so he wrote these Bairn Rhymes for her and dedicated them to her. And he and MacDiarmid disagreed on this. MacDiarmid's idea of, promoting the Scots language was that it had to be very sophisticated. He was, his take on it was quite intellectual, a lot of synthetic Scots. Whereas Souter's view was, if the Doric is to come back alive, it will come on a cocked horse, as that quote says there. And that, the nursery rhymes were the way to do it, to get the children learning Scots, and then they'd grow up and speak it more easily to their children, and so it would revive in the nation. So,
and was Souter writing right up to the inner end?
Oh yes, he was. And the thing about being bedbound is it did curtail his life. It meant he never married, he never earned his own living, but he had an enormous amount of time to write, and he wrote all the time. He kept diaries, he kept dream diaries, he wrote essays and reviews for magazines. He wrote poetry all the time in Scots and English. He's a very good poet in English as well, though I tend to think his Scots poetry just has the edge on that. It is the better poetry, I think. And he had a lot of recognition. I mean, the interesting thing is that the foremost poet in Scots at that time was obviously MacDiarmid. But there was one newspaper review of Souter's work which referred to him as the foremost poet in Scots. And MacDiarmid was, for all his...
Did he tap the pen?
He did. He was very annoyed. And Souter paid for that later, actually, because after his death, Jack Souter, Souter's father, commissioned MacDiarmid to collect all the poetry together and edit a collected edition. Which MacDiarmid did, but he prefaced it with an essay. And in this essay, he was very mean-spirited about Souter and his achievements. And, that, it's fairly clear, stemmed from sort of, a desire that nobody should seem to come close to him in terms of being the poet in Scots, So he used phrases like a minor talent and, referred to his verse as unmusical, the unexciting jog trot of his verse, I think he said. Criticisms which weren't warranted and weren't necessary because, I think objectively probably MacDiarmid is the greater poet, so he didn't need to shoot down the opposition. But I think this essay had a lot of influence on how Souter was regarded by the critical establishment.
So you think it maybe put folk off Souter for a time?
I think it did. I think it did in the in university, courses, you'll study Souter, but otherwise he's not so widely known, And I think that is a shame, and I think, the culture is missing out on a fabulous poet, really. So he finally, the disease he had was called ankylosing spondylitis, and it's a sort of arthritis of the spine, so gradually you freeze up. So as the years went by, he spent 13 years in bed, and gradually he became a living statue. Because he wrote a lot and fed himself and smoked terribly, I'm afraid to say, he could move his hands, but the rest of him more or less froze up. But that wouldn't have killed him. What killed him was he caught tuberculosis. And in those days, before the drugs were available, that was a death sentence. So yeah, so he died in 1943, and in due course, when his father came to the end of his life, he left this house as a permanent memorial.